Okay, so today we'll discuss the mirror stage, which is the fundamental process of subject formation, or where the subject formation starts. More than anything else, it has to do with ideal ego formation. From their own ego ideal and the superego and spring out. But first of all, we need to discuss this process, how does it take place. Of course, it takes place through the other, as everything which has to do with subject formation. We are the other. The other speaks through us. I is the other. One of the aphorisms that Lacan used to utter quite often. So how does it happen? This schema, which is called single mirror schema or construction, will help us to illustrate it. If you're interested in how does single mirror work in relation to theory of optics, you're welcome to read Lacan. He explicates on that in great detail. Here, I particularly look at what conclusions did he come to using this schema. Of course, mirror stage is the foundational to Lacanian theory as well. This is what differentiated him from the rest of the psychoanalytic community in his time. When he presented the paper on the mirror stage, it kind of laid foundation to this process of ego formation and led to defining the fundamental concept of psychoanalytic theory in Lacanian key, which is alienation in the other. So we'll look how does it happen. First, let's discern what's at stake. Remember, first the child encounters partial drives. And these are depicted by the flowers on the schema. Drives are fragmented, pertaining to different erogenous zones of the body, such as skin, anus, mouth, eyes, gaze, eyes, ears. And they inchoate, they're fragmented. Phenomena are disjointed. Everything exists in a state of kind of primordial soup in the infant's body. Sensations are disorganized, hence they are disturbing. So they need to be organized in some way. And that way is basically mother's mirroring. Mother's mirroring. How does it happen? Well, through everything that mother does. Holding, feeding, lulling, pacifying, etc. Washing, wiping, changing diaper, everything. What the mother speaks, how she looks, how she smells, how she touches. All of it. So what happens in the mirror stage is that partial drives kind of become organized by this experience of the mother's mirroring. So initial fragmentation, initial disorganized continuity of the child's body becomes organized once these sensations, which come from the love and care and witnessing and support of the mother, are incorporated as one's own. The analogy of the mirror is that at some stage, a child sees one's reflection in the mirror and superimposes upon those reflections desire and love of the mother towards the child. By seeing oneself in the mirror, there is this aha moment. Aha, so this is what my mother loves, desires, cares for. Hence, the ideal ego is born. So mother's mirroring precisely was depicted here by the mirror is mother's image and desire. So via the reflection in the mirror, the inchoate intensities pertaining to the drive appear enclosed. And so here we have that which they enclosed into. This here, depicted as the vase, is an imago. Imago. is a combination of that which comes from the field of the other. Their way of speaking, their way of looking, their somatosensory plethora that they give one. Remember, the perception at this stage of nascent subjectivity is hallucinatory. It's enmeshed. Sensations and images and words are enmeshed. And this is what imago is. It's a kind of imprint which is taken from the field of the other. Through mother's mirroring, it becomes reflected upon the partial drives. Of course, there comes another demand. Remember how desire forms demand towards the other, and this what this line signifies. Back to mother's mirroring. Mirroring again reflects to imago. Imago back to mirroring, and once again to the drive. And eventually what happens? The drives become incorporated into that imago. So previously located kinda on the other side, on the side of the other. Now the imago is located on the side of a subject and has a function of enclosing or organizing the partial drives. So this is now where ideal ego is born. Yeah, ideal ego is born here. So at this stage, that bodily disorganization stops being so. There is a certain sense of totality, sense of wholeness that has arisen at this stage via the incorporation of the imago from the field of the other, via this continuous process of demand, response of the other, incorporation of a certain element of imago upon the drives, which binds the drives, pacifies them, makes them subjugated to the image and desire of the other. Then this process repeats again on and on, until eventually a certain state of wholeness, completeness, totality, and an absence of dukkha, one might say, is achieved. Yeah. This here is the birthplace of the imaginary register. Why? Well, it is because on the image that one relies in order to organize the drives. Of course, what is image? Image is a form of delusion, isn't it? It's the mental formation. It is that which is taken from the other. It's fabricated, it's created. And lo and behold, it helps to organize the real pertaining to dukkha of the body, libidinal tension pertaining to the drive. So by this imaginary means, well, imaginary symbolic, because every subject is always already born in some kind of the symbolic universe alongside the imaginary one. The real gradually becomes organized. Once this ideal ego has set in, the subject to be starts incorporating pleasurable experiences and objects into one's ego, which sustain and support it, and expels unpleasurable objects which somehow challenge or cancel out the thus acquired image and desire of the other. Obviously, this is the birthplace of preferences and biases and everything of this order. But this is what needs to be in order to draw the subject's consciousness away from the intensity and anxiety pertaining to the real. Yeah. All in all, the process of incorporation and expulsion is a very dualistic situation. It's known as the dualistic imbroglio of the primary narcissism within this theory. Why? Because one is kind of enmeshed by virtue of this hallucinatory perception into the process of this brings me pleasure, this brings me pain, this I deny, this I incorporate, which is a bit paranoid, this process, isn't it? Some objects which are otherwise perfectly neutral, but that comes later when learning difference in the symbolic comes to the picture. At this stage, they are seen as fear-provoking, fear-producing. So if we give a little classification of what chronologically or logically happens during the development, and this is what's called complex within this theory. First would be the weaning complex, and that happens from birth pretty much till about 6 months. What happens here is the fusion with the other and the oral object A, oral partial drive via the breast, becomes interrupted. One is gradually being taken away from the breast. For some it lasts longer, for up to even 2 years, but that's okay. Second stage, logically coming out of this one, is intrusion complex. Intrusion complex. And intrusion complex is just another name for the mirror stage. This is whereby this mirror image of the other's love and desire is incorporated via imago to create one's ideal ego. And this is what amounts to, maybe I'll use another color, alienation. Alienation in the other. So ideal ego is nothing else as the image and desire superimposed upon one's own real being, because one doesn't yet know or is unable to deal with one's real being. So one has to alienate in the image and desire of the other. Thus being separated from one's ideal being, real being. That's roughly 6-18 months. The process of development. And the next one you might have guessed, good old Freudian famous Oedipus complex. Oedipus complex, which roughly arises from 18 months to 5 years. 5 years. And this is where one incorporates image of the father. Yeah. Here we have what's at stake is the image of the breast. Here is the image of the, well, mother. And here is the image of the father. Again, stepping away from the nuclear family, or nucleus family was the right word to say it. Kind of patriarchal classic family function of the breast. Yeah, that kind of hard to take away. That's gonna be just the breast, nothing else. Function of the mother, maybe a caregiver of any other sort, which primarily, or the first other, which primarily takes care of the subject, and this would be the other from whom via imago ideal ego is incorporated. The second one, the father, would be again the function, precisely that which orchestrates separation from the mother, and from where agencies such as ego ideal and ideal ego, ego ideal and the super ego are incorporated. I will, in the next lesson, explain how does this process take place. Anyhow, this is the process of separation, sort of on the border of imaginary symbolic. And another complex which follows after that is castration complex, another Freudian famous. which is kind of indefinite. It may actually never be completed. So this is precisely whereby the subject allows the symbolic lack, or lack within the symbolic, to be accepted. Bejahung, the affirmation of lack, takes place, and thus takes one out, for better or worse, from this imbroglio of primary narcissism, which amounts to capacity to use language and function as the subject within signifiers, basically, following the dialectical exchange within the signifiers. So, a bit more detail in regards to the intrusion complex, or the mirror stage. How does all of these lines, how do they happen? First of all, there is the demand, right, from the child to the other, to the first other, to appease the internal drive, the internal anxiety and fear producing tension, accompanied with the sense of fragmentation and the dukkha of the body, basically, dukkha of the drive, real dukkha. This demand needs to be witnessed first. So there must be, well, at least in the course of so-called normal or ordinary development, if you like, witnessing of the demand, of the distress that the child experiences needs to be done. And yeah, that's not a rocket science. Every mother does so, or every parent does so, provided that they have a certain sense of responsibility towards their children. Next, there must be response coming from that other, response to the child in some way. It may be an action, it may be a word, but it needs to address the distress which the child presents them with. Encouragement then ought to follow. Encouragement. So the nascent subject is somehow lulled or pacified or held on to or spoken to gently or lovingly in order to make the distress bearable at this particular moment. This all leads to validation, thus making distress that the child comes with as valid, as accepted, basically, as reasonable. So say maybe these three happen on the level of speech. And speech here is major because through speech one attains what? Signifiers. And the signifiers lay foundational to both ideal ego and the ego ideal and superego later on. So signifiers are incorporated and thus create conscious and unconscious. Conscious would be ideal ego, unconscious would be, in some cases, well, it is superego, because it is a demanding and imposing voice coming from within, but that already happens a bit later on through the Oedipal triangulation. First, that which is not incorporated as a part of ideal ego, dislodged into unconscious, which then becomes repressed. Or in case of the psychotic subjectivity, where the alienation is total, it is rejected entirely. Anything distressful or displeasing to the ideal ego thereby is expelled. Although in psychosis there is another issue at stake, namely the failure to a certain extent of the process of specular identification, which is that what it is, identification on the level of the mirror stage. By the way, why is it called intrusion complex? Because pretty much the other is intruding upon the real being of the subject. Of course, it's beneficial to appease the drive, but it's also not beneficial because that encourages delusion, which then is worked through by means of Oedipal triangulation or not. And that would be the case for psychotic structure. And then psychotic has to come up with their own solution for delusion. We'll look into that in detail when we break down each subjectivity. So let us look at the results. What ideal ego gives to the subject. What are the brownie points? First of all, it enables one to perceive oneself as successful at appeasing the drive. It provides a sense of completion. Sense of completion. Or totality, sense of totality. Sense of totality. Then another characteristic is that provides a sense of self-mastery. And self-realization at the level of imaginary. And most importantly, it pacifies the drive. The real of drives. Pacifies the real of drives. So at this stage, having acquired ideal ego, a subject is virtually free from dukkha. Again, on the level of, I should write it down, yeah. All of this exists on the imaginary level. This here is the birthplace of imaginary register of psyche. Why imaginary? Well, because imago, image and desire of the other, is superimposed onto the real of the drive, having thus pacified them, or temporarily pacified them. It is an ever-collapsing structure, this ideal ego. And we'll see later on how it becomes complex, evolves into ego ideal, superego, and then other registers come into play. Why it is, again, unstable? Well, again, because it is copy-pasted from the other, incorporated in order to expel that which is disturbing and painful. Of course, at this stage here, there is not yet capacity to endure displeasure of phenomena without becoming bewildered. This can only be acquired later on through spiritual practice or the training of the mind, which precedes spiritual practice, and it must be there before spiritual practice. There is no spiritual practice without mental development, if some of you don't know. But because infant has no capacity for mental mastery, bewilderment is the real thing, yeah? And bewilderment is what is going to happen, because internal pressure thwarts and subverts sense of any kind of stability. Since we take this crutch of ideal ego, we have no other choice, it's only natural and appropriated. Thus, imaginary register arises. Okay, a few more important consequences of this process. Oh, cool. On both sides can erase. So, the very first consequence is that physical and mental boundaries are constructed. Construction of boundaries. So if before the experience was that of a flux, the body of a child is not separated from the body of a mother, the mirror image incorporated provides this boundary. And this is crucial because subjectivities which have not entered this, the alienation in the image provided by the other, remain on the level of pre-subjective. We call it level of narcissistic fusion. These are subjectivities such as autistic and psychotic, which is not a negative thing. It's a structure. It's the way development has taken place. Further down the line, we shall look in detail at any of these every one of these subjective structures, which in Lacanian theory are four: autistic, psychotic, perverse, and neurotic. So this is crucial to grasp beforehand, that prior to construction of boundaries, states of fusion are retained, and then subjectivity, if it is based on these states of fusion, well, is a fusion type subjectivity. Nevertheless, if development progresses with the acquisition of the image and desire of the other, again provided the mirror and it was good enough, yeah, by the other, then boundaries are constructed. Second consequence, jubilation. Because of self-recognition. Jubilation. It arises because a child, having gained the sense of autonomy, alienation in the image creates sense of autonomy, and hence jubilation arises. Why? Because, woohoo, I am me. I have arms and legs and I can run away from my mommy or run towards my mommy or hide and crawl around and explore phenomena. Which follows playfulness. Exactly because of autonomy. Because of autonomy, yeah, there is, oh, and that is accompanied with now motor coordination. So one might say that because of motor coordination, these two take place. Image appropriate from the other allows for motor coordination, yes indeed. Before that, fusion, not to say that the motor coordination doesn't come in autistic or psychotic subjectivities, yes they come of course, via a bit of a different mechanism. But here it is accompanied with acquisition of the image of the other, from the other. The capacity to explore one's autonomy arises through the acquisition of the image of the other. This is very clear to see in the children when they are when they have acquired this, when they have gone through this period. Actually, it's also worth noting that this period arises from 6 to 18 months. 6 to 18 months, mirror stage. Before that, actually I should probably write it down, shouldn't I? Before that there was period of weaning. Weaning complex, whereby the breast has become in the focus of the child's attention, either taken away or incorporated in and also always in between this experience of child and the mother. And this is gradually is interrupted, yeah. It of course doesn't stop at 6 months. Breastfeeding can go for longer, up to 2 years in some cases. Then from that follows the mirror stage, or the intrusion complex, according to psychoanalytic categorization. And this complex is, okay, I'll try to stick it somewhere on the board. Maybe here. So weaning, then intrusion, then Oedipus. And then castration complex. These are complexes, yeah. Weaning, separation from the breast. Intrusion complex, separation from the other. This is what we are looking at right now. Oedipus complex. Further separation from the other. We will look into that in the next lecture. And castration complex, even further separation. So this is separation from the fusion. This is separation from the, well, actually this is separation from the fusion. This is partial separation from the fusion. This is separation from the first other through triangulation. Second other, be it father or whatever, or function of language, separates a subject from the reliance upon the first other, because here there is still reliance on the first other via the imago taken from the first other, which in Oedipus complex subject is separated from. This here occurs from the 18 months to 5 years. This probably is not clear. "18 months to 5 years. This here occurs from 6 to 18 months. This here occurs from 0 to 6 months. And this is kind of indefinite. Castration complexes whereby a subject is separated to a certain extent from the second other as well, through the function of language. This is, well, we can say 5 years onwards, through the enculturing and education, acquisition of signification, knowledge, symbolic knowledge, and ultimately recognition that second other is also lacking to produce a complete answer for the pressure of the drive. We will come back to this. Okay, so here there is a beginning of all this jubilation, playfulness, motor coordination, etc. Then, important moment, acquisition of knowledge occurs, but it's not a symbolic knowledge which occurs here at the level of oedipization, oedipal complex, and the castration complex. It's the knowledge which is, well, Lacan calls it paranoid knowledge. Or alienated knowledge. And it's actually worth looking at how does this process occur. This is, they categorize as the first period of mirror stage. Physical and mental boundaries, jubilation, playfulness, and acquisition of knowledge. Second period we'll look after, but first I have to free up the board a bit. Or, okay, maybe not. So here, Paranoid knowledge. Paranoid knowledge. Why paranoid? Well, because it's self-referential. Everything at this stage is taken as a measure of relation as towards oneself, towards the ideal ego, which is incorporated here via imago. The way it happens, a unit of information, is detected in the world. Whatever this unit of information is, an object, an image, a word, a sound, a feeling, whatever. Then it is perceived to refer to oneself and reveal something about oneself. So it's self-referential and revealing. Why is it revealing? Because ideal ego here tries to incorporate as many units of information as possible in order to construct a more complex sense of identity. So whatever object is probed, because all objects are information units are new at this stage, there is not yet pool of memory formed to refer back to, and this here is where these pools of memory are being formed at the stage of acquisition of paranoid knowledge. So then, having self-referentially been perceived and having revealed a certain truth about oneself, it is incorporated via identification. Or not incorporated via this identification. So here we are back to towards this process of incorporation and expulsion. Incorporation and expulsion happens now from the, well, it only happens from the standpoint of ideal ego. Units of information are referred back to oneself, seen as supporting or not supporting the subject, and measured by that value only. All the units of information which do not support this sense of totality vouchsafed by image and desire of the other are thrown away. Where do they thrown away? Where are they thrown away to? Where do we write it down? Well, to here, yeah, to the unconscious, where drives are. So some of the units of information perceived by the subject in the world will not support this imago, simply because this imago is not all-inclusive. It's just the imago. It is only fulfilling on the basis of certain characteristics that support it. When these characteristics are not supportive, well, the experience which arises is that of displeasure. And that experience throws one back onto the drives, onto the experience of fragmentation and disorder, discord. Hence, that which has provoked such a throwback is repressed into the unconscious. Well, if it's a neurotic structure, it can be either rejected or foreclosed, and we'll look into that further on, how these mechanisms of structural exclusion operate on different levels of subjectivity. So this period of acquisition of paranoid knowledge is referred to by Lacan as nihilism. Nihilism. Because everything is perceived from the stance of me and mine. It's a violent tendency to measure everything through oneself. And that's what we start with as human subjects. And hopefully we progress, evolve from there. Well, not in all cases though. Sometimes these traits of imaginary mirror identification and paranoid knowledge and that which follows out of it, which is rivalry, jealousy, hate and love, competition with others for best embodiment of the same ideal. And we'll look into it in a moment. All of it characterizes imaginary mode of relating to the world. Why? Well, because it's rooted in this, in alienation in the image. Then we seek to sustain ourselves with images which have been supportive of that, with experiences, phenomena, traits of character, signifiers, habits, whatever that support that ideal ego. Then we take from the symbolic other knowledge which supports it, but that already refers to ego ideal, which comes later in Oedipal triangulation. At first is this, it's the self-referential acquisition of paranoid knowledge. Why it's paranoid? Because it's unstable. Whenever this knowledge is shaken by introduction of the element, the unit of information which doesn't support the vouchsafe image which this knowledge tries to describe, well, it's sort of destabilized. And that's, as we will see, characterized as psychotic experience more than anything, because in psychotic experience this process is attempted all the time, because the specular identification, which is what this is, specular identification process, has not taken place enough, I would say, and separation from fusion has not occurred. Hence, the image is the only refuge of a subject, and the field of knowledge which supports that image must be preserved at all costs. Hence, we then face delusional metaphor and paranoid schizophrenic organization of reality. Anyway, a couple of more of important consequences. So there's the first period of mirror stage. Second period, let us look at. Number 5. Something that is called high enumeration. Heine, plus amour, excuse my French, because it's non-existent. Hate and love. That's the chief characteristic trait of nihilism or paranoid knowledge, imaginary mode of relating to the world. From the standpoint of ideal ego, other egos are discerned and rendered through the ideal ego. And this process is the basis for what we call social relations and social reality. Inevitably, alter egos or other egos are met with struggle. There is admired or met with suspicion or downwardly hated. Why? Because there is a correspond to the ideal ego which one has acquired, or they embody better the ideals which have been appropriated by subject. So let's write it down. It can either be admiration, yeah, in case that the other embodies the ideal better than me, it can be struggle. Struggle and suspicion. Because the other doesn't, because we don't quite understand what other is about, yeah? What it embodies, how it corresponds to my ideal ego. And at this stage, otherness is not mad friendly, it's disrupting inherently, because it disrupts this ideal ego. And if that is disrupted, ta-da, we fall back on the drives. And another one, well, hatred. That is in the case when the otherness does not support one's ideal ego at all, which causes one straight away to fall back onto the inchoate intensity of the drive within one's psychic space. And what one does when this happens, well, this is projected onto the other, because we don't know yet how to deal with this sense of displeasure within ourselves. So it's better to project it on other and hate it. It's easier. Cause of one's displeasure is seen in the other is to blame and to hate. There are a few ways that hate can be experienced. Like with this, two is pretty clear. Admiration is just that. We idealize the other or figure him out before we have either idealized or hated the other. But when hate comes, that is experienced in a few different ways. The first one, intrusion. Intrusion. I hope you can understand my writing. If not, you can just hear me and don't mind what I'm scribbling here. Intrusion. Well, here, disruption to the ideal ego occurs. Disruption. Then, displeasure is projected onto the other. Projection. And the other is hatred. Hatred arises. So the other in here is intruder, completely not supportive of one's ideal image. The other way is rivalry. Rivalry. When the other is perceived to relate to the same ideal, competition comes to be. Let's write it down. Competition. And in competing for the love, because that's what it is, based on love and attention, remember, of the other. In competing with the other for love, the subject seeks to eliminate the other. In order to best embody the ideal which one has identified with. This is often seen in the family with siblings, isn't it? Children are competing for the mother's love, parents' love, trying to best embody it and get rid of the competitors. And the third mode is jealousy. Here here there is certain sameness. Here is complete otherness. And here it is the other is perceived as advantageous. Advantage of the other. If the other is perceived as having advantage over oneself in embodying ideal ego, then it is met with jealousy. It is perceived as having something that one lacks. And again, it needs to be eliminated. Here we have the platter of human wrathfulness, or basis for conflict. They are all here on this initial level of acquisition of identity. When that's nuanced to a certain extent by the ego ideal, superego, acquisition of knowledge, training, particularly training and mindfulness and compassion, then this chance for conflict is less. But if the training has not taken place, education has not taken place, separation has not taken place, well, the world will be met from the lens of conflict. And this leads us to the sixth consequence, and I'll have to erase everything else here to write it down. That leads us to the fact that competition with the other based on jealousy is enjoyable. What do we see? Sports. When the competition occurs, particularly at this level, it's the most tantalizing, isn't it? It's most fulfilling when the victory occurs, and it's destroying when the defeat occurs. That's why mass sport events are so charged with violence, perhaps, when one group of fans is supporting one team and another group of fans another team. And here we see the rivalry between two ideal egos, or between two groups which try to best embody ideal, and the one who wins, well, hates the other one. So the one who wins has eliminated the other one, and hence this, oh yeah, I should have written down fulfillment. Fulfillment. Fulfillment occurs. Satisfaction. Enjoyment. And that brings us to the sixth consequence. I'll get rid of this. Jealousons. Jealousy plus jouissance. Jealousy plus jouissance. Enjoyment of jealousy, enjoyment of competition, which again occurs on the egoic level. Jealousy, which is a form of hate, or the way hate is expressed, mixed with the drive, which is what it is, the expression of the drive which exceeds its quota of pleasure, as we have seen in the lecture on the drive. That puts the body in a state of uproar. Uproar. It is exhilarating, and it leads to either satisfaction in case of victory over the other, and the assemblable which one competes with, or it can lead to frustration if defeat occurs. So here we can see the initial mode of relationship between the children at the young age. The reason it occurs is because the ideal ego is unstable. It is way easier to project the drive pressure onto the other and compete with that other for the ideal image one wants to embody. And how to phrase it? I might have to read it. Imaginary interpersonal interpretation of hated and envied semblable other give face to internal expression of the drive, which can never be incorporated by an ego. So what I just said here. Imaginary interpersonal interpretation of hated and envied semblable other. This is what occurs through paranoid knowledge. The other is perceived as either similar or different to one's own ideal ego. And if it's hated, it puts the body in a state of uproar, which gives the expression to the drive. Here, expression of the drive. But that's never fulfilled, so another footy season next year. Why? Because, well, drive can never be incorporated into here. This here is just a box over the drives, or in this case, ways. Just a makeup, just a prosthetic device to contain the drive. However, encounter of otherness will inevitably produce some kind of disturbance on the level of ideal ego, and hence the drive will be bared. If it is other which is hated, the expression of the drive will occur. And if it's loved, the expression of drive will also occur. This is what we call positive transference. But in either way, either through loved other, semblable other, or through hated, semblable other, the drive in both cases is projected. It's not processed, but projected. Processing comes later, when there is distancing, when there is capacity to use language, when there is a training and mindfulness to a certain extent. Then this pressure of the drive can be processed. Before that, it's just projected, either onto adored other, same other. That's the basis for friendship as well, isn't it? Or completely different and hated other. In altercation with which produce expression of the drive via, well, competition, struggle, fight, perhaps. So sporting events function on this level. Footy, whatever other sports, where we separate ourselves from teams and etc. Play our ideals out. Nothing but expression via projection, that's all. Which produces temporarily easing off of the internal drive pressure. But it will reoccur, simply because ideal ego, once appeased, still remains ideal ego. And it's still insufficient to fully embody, to process the drive. So, this whole scheme kind of shows that at this level the subjectivity is anatta, which is a Pali word for not self. How is that so? Well, we have just seen that self arises via projective identification taken off from the other. Before that, there is no self. And after it, there is no self either, except of imaginary self. There are further layers of self which occur further with Oedipal triangulation, symbolic self. But here, the real, the drive is precisely that. It's devoid of self. Another important consequence that follows, and write it down, the seventh one of the mirror stage, is the capacity for, Jesus Christ, my writing skills deteriorate the more I write, self-awareness. Self-awareness. Capacity for self-awareness arises here with acquisition of the imaginary identification. Why? Well, precisely due to all the previous consequences, most important of which is the constitution of boundaries. Again, here, if the mirroring of the other is good enough, if there was, what were those stages? Witnessing, response, encouragement, and validation of the child's experience of displeasure, then ideal ego embodied will be good enough. It will provide a stable enough foundation for a subject to create further layers of identity. However, if this mirroring is not good enough, it's either there is either no witnessing, or no response, nor encouragement, and no validation. The mother is either not there, or her attention is not there, or she doesn't respond, doesn't encourage, or doesn't validate the child's experience. The ideal ego will not be strong enough. Yeah. And if it won't be strong enough, then the subject will be at the risk of psychotic decompensation later in life. Or, well, autism is a different story, but psychosis is primarily, it's arising from there. Either from here, not sufficient mirroring, or from here, but on the outside. If the pressure of the drive or the dukkha quality of external reality, such as, where do you write it? Yeah, right here, trauma. So this here, if the violent action has occurred, has been committed in the field of this process, the formation of the ideal ego, it will leave imprint. In this case, this here projection will not be insufficient to fully incorporate the partial drives. Well, it never be sufficient, but in case of traumatic intrusion, it will not be sufficient per se. And it's just a fact that will persist. Initially, well, eventually, a subject is to realize the insufficiency of the imaginary crutches as such, but before these crutches have been formed, such a realization cannot occur. This is why we find that in psychotic subjectivity, which is where this process has not fully adequately taken shape. That's why the imaginary always in a state of being formed and always in a state of being relied on. There is no possibility to transcend the imaginary. Yeah? So here then we have the twofold causality for the psychic disturbances, say, or subjectivities which are fusion type. It's either mirroring has not been adequate, witnessing, response, encouragement, and validation have not been executed to a sufficient degree for that particular subject, or the violent event occurred. In either way, then, exposure to this, to the real of selflessness of phenomena, will be premature. If there is such a thing, well, we are born into this world without any really codification apart from that which we have created ourselves. And we are plunged into this, that there is no self underlying the experience, that the only self that is formed is via this mirroring, and it is imaginary. And then on the basis of this self arises the symbolic self, which is language-based self. So then when we are alienated in the image and in the language, both of which are connotations of North self. And like I said, eventually, if one is to embark on a spiritual path, that this fact of traumatic quality of the real, of the drives and the real of embodied experience must be entered. And in order to enter it, one has to cut through the ideal ego. But one cannot do this if the ideal ego has not formed adequately. Yeah. So this is why the supportive, successful mirroring and the environment which is free from disturbance, free from traumatic encounters in early childhood is imperative. It must be maintained and provided at the best of people's ability. But of course, the world is an imperfect place. Things happen. And human subjectivity is fragile. When we later on look at the formation of the registers of the psyche, we'll see how all of this entails the imaginary register, formation of the imaginary register of the psyche. It must be healthily entwined with symbolic registers through the acquisition of the name of the father and the paternal metaphor and the language itself and the prohibition. And it must work in such a way that it can be reinforced, enriched by the real of drive phenomena. As we have seen in the scheme of the drive circle, drive thrust passes through the other in order to bring something of the real of the drive into the field of the other, into the field of culture, and subjective existence, and thus enrich it. And at the same time, the portion of the drive becomes inscribed or processed and, well, subjected to the other, to the culture, to a certain extent. And this is the way these registers function in harmony. But if one is lacking or underinstated, either it's imaginary register at this stage due to trauma or insufficient mirroring, or it's a symbolic at the later stage due to lack of the paternal triangulation, or if it's the real due to the lack of practice which enables one to draw upon one's drive. Such practice could be psychoanalysis, such practice could be spiritual practice, such practice could be art, many practices that do that. So that's, if any of the registers is not insufficient functioning, then subjectivity will be, well, experience of subjective existence will be less fulfilling or unbearable and traumatic. So in order to realize the unbearability of phenomena, we must establish a certain grounding which is good enough in a bearability of phenomena, and the mirror stage is what helps us to do that. Okay, well, that should be enough for today. We will continue further on with the Oedipal stage and the paternal triangulation. So, thank you.